Welcome to the Mental Health Podcast. We've been talking about the 5 mental health mountains that challenge people, and we've talked about them and the impact they have on ourselves, or directly or indirectly on those that we love or work with. And I'm your host today, Warren Evans, Chief Exec of Sports Chaplains UK, and I'm with my good friend, and he doesn't like this, but he is an expert in all things, Dr. Alan Johnson. Welcome, Alan.
Thanks, Warren. Great to be with you again, and I'll eventually get used to you calling me an expert.
Alan, we've looked at a number of things, but just before we continue, just introduce yourself, give people a little feel of who you are and what you do.
Thank you, and thanks for your time today. We're climbing the last of 5 mountains today, aren't we? So it's been a really enjoyable experience for me today. I know today's topic is serious and important. But yeah, great pleasure to be with you again. I'm Dr. Alan Johnson. I'm a sports psychiatrist. So that means I'm a doctor of mental health, and I do that primarily now in sports. I work across the Team GB systems, the Olympic and Paralympic sports, via the English Institute of Sports, looking after athletes. I look after football managers with the League Managers Association, based down at St George's Park. I'm often based here in Yorkshire. I'm in Leeds, where I have a couple of clinics. And I'm lots of other things too. I've been saying so far, you must be bored of hearing of it, but it's important to bring like a human aspect, I suppose, to our work. So I'm a man, I'm a dad, I'm a husband and a brother and a father and a neighbour. And I hope I've drawn lots of other things when I'm helping people.
And he's also a great friend and ambassador for Sports Chaplains UK, and as someone I really do appreciate his wisdom and input. We've looked, as you've already stated, we've looked at some of these mountains, the mountains of depression, anxiety, addictions, anger, stress in previous podcasts. And if people haven't heard them, I suggest you go back and listen, because some great models in there, some great tools, some signposting that you will find helpful. But today we're looking at managing risk, and this could include quite a wide range of things. And so we're always sensitive when we look at a sensitive topic like this, because it may bring up in you thoughts, ideas, and therefore we want to be sensitive about how that will impact you as you listen to this. And it's okay for these things to be brought up. It's what we do with those feelings and emotions, and Dr. Allen will touch on those. So when we're talking about things that maybe like self-harm or suicidal thoughts that may cause you concern, actually, as Dr. Allen will say, it's normal. Some of this is normal. It's then what we do with it. So over to you. When we say managing risk, let's phrase risk, let's say managing, and let's give people some ideas of what those risks might be.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for that, really thoughtful introduction. You're quite right to say that it's an important topic today. We need to be able to talk about this type of thing, don't we? We need to be able to talk about our thoughts, our feelings, even if they're negative or unhelpful. A big part of mental health is talking about how we feel. And a part of that might be when we're discussing things like risks around self-harm or suicide or neglect or other risks. It's really important we're able to talk about it, but today's topic could be triggering for some people. And so if now's not the right time for you to listen to it, that's okay too. This is a podcast you'll be able to access at another time, in another place. So thank you. Thanks for your thoughtful introduction there. We're talking about risk in a really broad way, aren't we? So people will often think about risk of self-harm or suicide. There are a host of other risks that we could present, and in many ways, sort of life is a risk. We're often balancing risk and reward, but people can develop risks with a whole range of other things: a risk of vulnerability, a risk to others, a risk of neglect or self-neglect. So we're probably going to be talking around self-harm and suicide a lot today, but we might think of risk as sort of the chance of something happening. And in this case, we mean the chance of something potentially negative happening or unhelpful happening. And within that will be things around self-harm and suicide. So risk and risk management, how to support and listen and care for, a person experiencing those thoughts. As you said, very common thoughts that many of us have had and many of us will have at times. How we manage and support that. That's the content of today's topic. And I hope we're going to do it justice.
I'm sure we're going to give our best. And just as you were sharing that, I know we've done something in the past with Mental Health Foundation for athletes, and some of the things that they find personally challenging, from identity to, as you were sharing, that transition. That's a big risk, or injury is a big risk to athletes, which is outside the same kind of transition for normal people, for a better phrase. I go, if most people go to school, get a job, or go to university and then get a job. But people involved in sport have been doing it since the age of 4 or 5, and they may be hitting it in the teens, and then they get rejection, or if they do become a professional, it doesn't always mean they earn lots of money neither. So that we look at Premiership football and think everyone earns that money, but a wheelchair elite athlete does not earn that kind of money, and yet when they finish a sport, they're starting their next career path, for a better phrase. Mm-hmm. When we're in the height of our career path, when we're quite safe, and for most people, I know that's changing in this current day and age, but for an athlete, then that transition can be a place of risk in that sense.
That's very true. So transition is a good place for us to start. I don't know if you remember 5 podcasts ago, we started talking about depression. And if you remember, depression had biological and cognitive symptoms, and those cognitive symptoms, those depressive thoughts, came in what was called Beck cognitive triad. So 3 symptoms. We have negative thoughts about ourselves, the future, and the world around us, which we can think of as negative thoughts about ourselves, worthlessness, negative thoughts about our future, hopelessness, and negative thoughts about the world around us, pessimism. And there were those 2, the first 2, that are particularly prominent for many people in thoughts of self-harm or suicide. So today we might be touching on issues around hope and worth, and how suicide or self-harm thoughts can be linked to feelings of hopelessness, feeling that these things won't get better, or feeling of worthlessness, a feeling that we're no good, or that we're not improving ourselves or the lives of the people around us. And so hopelessness and worthlessness are 2 big factors that we see in risk, including self-harm and suicide. And as you quite rightly said, coming back to sport, sport is a risky business to be in, physically, mentally at times. And sudden transitions, sudden injury, an injury that ends or limits a career, or a career that doesn't really quite get going. A person expects their career to look like this, and they don't quite make it, perhaps out of the academy into the first team or something like that. And so when those life transitions affect our hope or our self-worth, so for example, an athlete retiring, as you said, often in their, say, 30s, has another, say, 30, 40 years of life to support and to fund, then that could affect their hope, their thoughts about the future, or their worth, their thoughts about themselves, as they go from athlete to non-athlete. And we can all relate to that. It would apply to teachers, doctors, lawyers, chaplains, as we transition from one place to another. We might find that affects our hope or our worth, these 2 factors in risks.
I love, for me, there's a whole nother podcast here on hope and worth. So I love that analogy, that observation about when we take people's hope away, or they feel hopeless, and then that whole self-worth, that where their value comes from, is such a powerful, I won't say tool, because that's not what I'm meaning, but it has a powerful impact on both from nature and nurture, when people have spoken maybe negative things when we're younger, to even as adults, we look in the mirror and say negative things to ourselves at times. So I like that the juxtaposition of hope and hopelessness, worth and self-value, and worthlessness. So how do we then look at managing some of these risks?
Yeah, that also gives us clues around its treatment, doesn't it? If these are 2 of the most powerful factors affecting risk, we've got ideas there. We might develop strategies around instilling hope or worth. First thing to say probably at this stage is that risk, including suicide and self-harm, is a very complex topic. We might have 20 or 30 minutes to cover it today, and we're going to try and do that justice, but it's a complex business, risk and risk assessment, risk management. I'm going to give some strategies that I might use in my day-to-day practice as a sports psychiatrist, but it's fair to say that it's complex, and we're all on a journey learning about how to support and manage risk all of the time, myself included. When we think about risks, one way of assessing it is to have a think about a person's thoughts, plans, intentions, and actions. So as I'm assessing a person's risk, let's say there's been a risk event, a period of self-harm, or a person has thoughts around that, I would want to assess those thoughts. And we might be able to use some of these strategies with ourselves or with friends and peers. We want to understand a person's thoughts, what's putting them under pressure. Has their hopelessness or worthlessness or pessimism been affected by something? What are their thoughts about? As thoughts progress, they can become plans of harming ourselves. A person might think of a day or date, of a method. And clearly today, we're not going to go into too much detail about that, but a thought becomes a plan when a person starts to crystallize a view and think, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do it here or there on that date. The person develops a plan to harm themselves. A person's intentions, their intent can be assessed by their actions or through their thoughts or plans. We want to understand what is a person's intentions. Sometimes behind an episode of self-harm could be what might seem a very different intent, the intent to access care or to find support or to express how they feel, or a way of managing emotional pain. A lot of athletes would tell me that they might self-harm because the physical pain they feel when they self-harm somehow helps them to manage the emotional pain that they feel. Maybe the physical pain is temporarily more straightforward or less complex than their emotional pain. So people might self-harm or have suicidal thoughts for a whole range of different intentions. When we're assessing that in a person, we want to understand, why they're thinking as they do, what are their intentions. And then finally, actions. We want to help a person with self-harm actions or suicidal type of actions, and understanding what a person has done in the past can help us to have some assessment of how they might feel now or what the risks are at present. So we start as a very general, broad brush way of describing it, but we want to understand a person's thoughts and feelings, plans, intentions, and actions. We want to try and understand why a person might be behaving as they did. We spoke about that very much in our previous podcast, didn't we, in the fourth mental health mountain around anger. Not just why is a person angry, but not just what is a person doing, but why are they doing it? Why are they angry? Why might they feel as they do? Well, we want to have the same approach to risk to oneself, understanding why a person's feeling like that. It may be related to mental health. It may be related to other things entirely, physical health. But we know that chronic painful conditions or complex physical health conditions can lead to risks, perhaps through the prism of worth and hope. And then coming on to treatment, we probably want to come back to worth and hope. But I'll pause there a second and wonder what you felt about that assessment approach.
Yeah, I'm absorbing it, to be honest. I'm reflecting on my own personal journey and personal challenges of when, if I've ever had a dark moment, and I don't have them all the time, but I've had them in my life, and that's me being vulnerable, that even as a leader, even as someone who seems, I won't say invincible, but you feel at times you can take on the world, and then other times you want to curl up in a ball and cry, or may even feel, and even logically, you may know this not to be true, but the dark moment is you feel that people will be better off without you, but your kids aren't going to be better off without you. But you have that moment of, and I know watching a video once of, it was about the Golden Gate Bridge. I think 2,000 people had thrown themselves off the bridge, and only some small number, maybe 5 or 20 people or whatever, had survived. And each of the people that had survived said, as soon as my hands had left the side of the bridge, I knew I didn't want to die. I just didn't know what the solutions were. And I think that's part of. It's interesting how you talked about self-harming, about nulling pain in a different area. And sometimes a bit like the bathtub model you talked about with stress, is sometimes when something is overwhelming, the only way out is the fire exit or an exit, which is always a positive one, rather than looking at how we can take the plug out or stop that stress coming in. And so for me, that the prism, looking through the prism of hope, and looking through the prism of worth, and realizing, certainly from me and my faith perspective, realizing that God places a worth on everybody. And even though the situation may seem hopeless, God certainly has a hope for you and a hope for me. So that's just my personal observations. And I'm certainly challenged as I reflect. And I know all that, and I still have my own personal challenges, but it doesn't impede me to continue to be the best person, best leader, hopefully a good friend, hopefully a good dad in that sense. As I move forward, but it doesn't mean we don't have those bumps on our life's journey.
Absolutely, very well put. As you said, life has its ups and downs, isn't it, for all of us? And the I suppose the catch-22 of a mental health condition like depression is that it might affect all of these thoughts at the same time. We might feel hopeless and worthless and pessimistic, but particularly in that hopelessness is one of the most the strongest correlations, the strongest factor which links to things like self-harm and suicide. I suppose in hopelessness, a person is robbed of their mood by depression, robbed of their hope, but they're also robbed of seeing the future. They know they're down, but they also don't feel it will ever get better. Or they know they're maybe not contributing as much as they used to their family, their community, but they don't feel they ever could in future. They feel completely worthless. And a lot of the highest risks are linked to things around hopelessness and worthlessness. So that gives a really big clue about what we should do and what all of us could and perhaps should do in our communities, our families, which is to instill hope. And there's always hope. Things will always get better. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always hope. Things can be seen in a different way. Things can be approached in a different way. Hopelessness kills people. And so we must instill hope. And that's a big part of my work. And very often there are things that we can measure or assess or look at differently with different therapies or different approaches. But yeah, instilling hope, instilling worth is a huge part of what I do and what we can all do to help a person to see, to listen to them, to care, to empathize, but to help them to see that things can turn around. Maybe sharing personal stories, as you just did, showing that that all of us can take dips and bounce backs. Seeing our worth, seeing sometimes people are really still contributing a lot to their families, as you said, as a dad to your children, but the individual stops seeing that and they can't see their worth anymore. And so it gives that catch-22 of lowering the mood and increasing the risk, but robbing the person of their vision of their future. It's probably also worth mentioning sometimes how fleeting and impulsive self-harm or suicide can be. A person might, in their whole life, spend 10 minutes being suicidal, but those 10 minutes could be really risky or really dangerous. And so it's about maybe instilling hope and worth at the right time. And that's why we see organizations like the Samaritans. They'll place signs and posters on locations whereby people may harm themselves. The Samaritans have a widely used phone number, 116-123, which is available 24/7, and people can reach out for, because it's that friend or that neighbor, it's that sign at that location that can divert a person from a very powerful but a very short-lived thought of hopelessness or worthlessness into a completely different action. So we can change suicidal behavior by intervening at the right time. There's a well-known supermarket, a national supermarket, that has trained its staff to intervene with people going to the checkout, buying a certain combination of substances. So, if, for example, if a person was to buy paracetamol, the checkout people, the checkout staff, are trained to intervene and to speak to that person. I think they say two basic things. They say, "Are you okay?" And "Do you really need that?" Meaning the alcohol or the medicine. And "Are you okay? Do they really need that?" That's the entirety of their training. That's all they do. But I believe that would save lives. And of course, they do it because they believe it saves lives. Because that intervention, that short word, that caring phrase delivered just at the right time can make a big difference. It could literally be life-saving and life-changing.
I love that. One of my favorite quotes from a gentleman called Zig Ziglar. And maybe I'm paraphrasing this, but it's small things, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and I quote it all the time. Small things done consistently creates massive change. And so I'm a big one. I always say, if you can smile, if you can share, motivate, inspire, love, and encourage people, then a simple smile can make a huge difference in someone's life. And at times we've got to smile at ourselves. I'm very conscious. I give a lot, like you, Alan, and sometimes our bucket can become empty, and we've got to be aware of that. And I take responsibility for allowing my bucket at times to get empty. But I am inspired and challenged and stretched by what you're sharing today, and I love it. Hope and worth, and I love speaking. And certainly for sports chaplains, we should be carriers of hope, and certainly speaking hope and worth over the people that we engage with, which is from athletes right down to the cleaning and the ticket office person, whoever it may be, the groundsman
Mhm.
or the elite staff, because everybody needs to hear it.
And that can be developed gradually, can it? If a person's really low in mood, we might have talked about this in our second mountain around anxiety. There's a strategy called graded exposure where a person might take steps gradually. They're looking to get back to here. They're currently feeling like they're here at rock bottom, and there could be 100 steps in between. As you just said, small things done consistently can take on a big journey. You're going to be taking a number of steps up Ben Nevis. I've climbed it a couple of times myself, and I can tell you there's a few steps there. But as you climb Ben Nevis, you might think about these small steps that we could all take in improving our mental health, small things done consistently. And as we instill hope or worth, we probably shouldn't expect the person's going to be at the top of the mountain on day one or week one or even year one. But we can instill hope and worth. We can help a person to see their value in really small ways at first, in small acts of kindness, in just being there for friends or family or their communities or neighborhoods. And hope and worth, it's often not something that is cured straight away, but something that can build gradually, step by step. And as you're climbing the zigzags of Ben Nevis, I'd like to think about it.
I will be reflecting and contemplating those step-by-step simple things that make a difference, and we need to be reminded. I guess as we reflect on some of this managing the risk, is the challenges that people, as you say, feel hopeless, feel worthless. So what would be an outward working of this for an athlete? And then what would be maybe the signs or just as you've said, in a supermarket chain, they ask two questions because people are buying certain products together to ensure that those simple questions, at least how they respond is up to the individual. But, most people are looking for response. When you're depressed, someone says, "How are you doing?" "I'm just tired," generally means you're depressed because you're tired and you're not always tired. So you're basically trying to duck out of answering a difficult question because you're not on top form. But how do we see those telltale signs in certainly athletes, and then how it may look like in different other people's lives?
Yeah, certainly. So I'd say athletes and general public have an awful lot in common when it comes to things around risks. It can affect any of us, and thoughts like that will probably affect all of us, or the majority of us at some stage. Being the last of our 5 mountains, we've covered a lot of content already, haven't we, around depression, anxiety, addictions, anger. And I suppose that reminds me that a lot of people who are risky, a lot of that risk might be related to mental health, stress, depression, anxiety, etc. So sometimes the treatments will be quite complicated. It will involve primary or secondary care, your GP or hospital doctors providing treatments, biological, psychological, social treatments for mental health problems. But we also know that 3/4 of people who die by suicide were not in touch with mental health services at the time that they passed. And so there's a lot of risk that doesn't relate to mental health problems. And maybe that shows sometimes accessing good mental health care is really quite difficult, with the way resources and things are stretched at the moment. And so that reminds me that part of the solution is going to be a complex one around treating mental health problems. But a big part of the solution is going to be a very powerful but very simple approach that we could all take, which might come back to our first podcast: caring and listening and empathizing, and having simple strategies that we can all do in our neighborhoods and our communities, in our church and faith groups. So I think it might come back to some things around empathy, care, active listening that we spoke about in our first podcast.
Yeah,
that's something we can all do. And as I said, that they train staff in some of our supermarkets to do, asking simple questions and taking simple approaches to managing things like suicide or self-harm.
That's really, again, I find this because it's so life-giving in that sense. As you say, there are so many people who are not in the care system in that sense, and yet struggle and make these life-changing decisions. And yet they've not just robbed themselves of hope because they're no longer around, but they're robbing other people of what they could have contributed to. I think of another favorite quote of mine: treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and then you'll help them become what they're capable of becoming. and I think that's Johann Wolf van Gogh. And for me, it's about words are very powerful, both what we say to people and what we say to ourselves. And so when we look at this, and it's difficult to, you've talked about being empathetic, listening, and certainly the other models are about drawing out of people why they feel like they feel. How do we then, when we're seeing these telltale signs that someone may be saying, I'm feeling tired, or they're late, or they're unkept, or all of a sudden they go through being unkept to super smart, and they've put their what perceived as their life in order, but in not a healthy way in that sense, because they're putting their life, because they're calling it a full stop rather than a comma for the rest of their life to continue, for a better phrase. So how do we? I think the fear is, do you ask someone, do you have suicidal thoughts? Because the fear is that will trigger them. But most of my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is generally people are wanting someone to ask them the question because it's a cry for help.
We need to be able to talk about suicide and self-harm. Of course we do. We need to find ways that work for the individual, though you're right. And so as a doctor, when I'm assessing that, it's something, I guess, that I would build up towards. I would assess a person's mood for those biological and cognitive symptoms of depression we talked about in the first podcast. I would assess a person's thinking, like we just said, with thoughts, plans, and intentions. But I think there are straightforward, plain English, if you like, phrases that we can use that can build towards asking around suicide or self-harm. And I might ask a person, of course, how they are and how they're doing and how's life. But we might build it towards that. Do you ever feel down? Do you ever feel hopeless or worthless? Do you ever feel that life isn't worth living? And then we might build towards as a doctor, I might build towards a more detailed assessment of suicide or self-harm. But in the general public, thinking about the people that listen to our podcast, we probably want to help a person have a phrase or two that they can use to assess self-harm or suicidal thoughts. A phrase that communicates to that person, so it's specific to the person, but it might be around something around, like you described, dark thoughts, negative thoughts. Do you ever have negative thoughts? Do you ever have dark thoughts? Do you ever feel that life isn't worth living? And we might find a way of exploring that. Of course, that's a difficult environment to work in. It takes a lot of skill and practice, a lot of which I'm still learning. But I think we should be able to talk about these things and spot the signs in our friends and colleagues, so we can get to a place where we can instill that hope and worth that we've been talking about today.
And from a psychological perspective, because some of this will be chemical, but most of it is neuro thought process. Your thinking, your value is all coming from your mind in that sense, and what you've taken on board for that phrase. Is there any tools? Is there anything? I know for me, we've talked about mindfulness, or we've not talked about mindfulness in any great depth, but you've implied about the skills of mindful or the benefits of mindfulness. But are there things that we can, for a better phrase, for an athlete, how does he de-stress? How do they get rid of some of those negative thoughts? How do they sweep away some of those attachments, for a better phrase? Does that mean a different environment, different people, ensuring that we do to remind people that we love them and we speak well of them, rather than telling a child off all the time, but say, hey, I love you, I care for you? And what, just from your perspective, Alan, what do you think should work on?
Sorry to sound like a broken record. Very individual by the person. But in general, I think coming back to that whole range of different steps that we can do, thinking about there's elite athletes. Yeah, as you said, there might be times where it's very hard to take time off work. They've got a game on Saturday or on Tuesday. But I still think it comes back to those core skills of listening. We might say, ask twice, how are you? How are you really? And caring and empathizing. That active listening we talked about in an earlier podcast, where you're not thinking about the next thing to say, but you're really paying attention to what the person's saying. And we all have those skills that we can learn and practice. So we can help ourselves and others. There are more complicated treatments and strategies that I might use as a sports psychiatrist. But I think it comes down to some basic skills that we all have and can practice listening, caring, empathy. I hope that makes sense.
Now, talking about managing risk, now suicide's a challenge because it's an act in that sense. It's a fine, or it can be a final act for someone, but others it might be a cry for help. So they may take medication, but it may not end their life. Praise, fortunately. But self-harming is one of those things I've seen, and I don't know if primarily for young ladies, young girls, but obviously it impacts men and women, which you can see if they're covering their arms up, and then you can see the scratch, the cut marks on their arms. What are one of the ways you could assess that situation, help someone, speak to them? Do you ignore it because of the shame for them, or do you say, just from your perspective, Alan, how would you address that?
Yeah, it's a complex field. Again, self-harm is very complex. It, of course, does affect men and women, affects both. Sometimes, I guess, self-harm in a man could be ignored with the thought that it's only something that affects women, which isn't the case. But I would say it comes back to that understanding of the reasoning and the rationale behind it, not just what a person's doing, but why they're doing it. So it might come back to understanding the person's stress and the feeling overwhelmed, the person's pain, including that emotional pain, that analogy we used around physical and emotional pain earlier, and that person's feeling of worth and hope. A person might harm themselves if they feel that they are worth less, if they feel that there's no reason, to look after themselves. A person might have suicidal self-harm thoughts if they feel hopeless, that there's no way forwards and they can't possibly recover. So it often comes down to understanding the rationale, the reason behind a person's actions, doing that in an open way, a non-judgmental way, a way that respects, and cares for the person in front of us. And I think a lot of my work will be in not just seeing what's happening, but really trying to understand why that happens. That's called a formulation, or about trying to formulate or understand the deeper reasons for why a person might be having self-harm or suicidal thoughts. And often there are very powerful reasons behind that. And it's not something that someone does lightly. It's not something often that someone wants to do. But understanding the why behind that through an assessment of their life situation, their mental health, their stresses, their perceived demands, perceived resources, work stress, family stress. And again, coming back to their self-worth, their thoughts about themselves, and their hope, the hopefulness for the future.
Well, Alan, again, this is another topic we can continue to talk about in greater detail, but the time has got away. But I do know at the end of this, we want to just signpost people a little bit more effectively in that sense. So, and I will close off. So you have been listening to Warren Evans and Dr. Alan Johnson. We've been talking about managing risk on suicide and self-harm and those things just to look for, but also those key antidotes, those key golden nuggets. And for me, it's about speaking hope into people, speaking value and worth into people, and that whole thing, asking twice, how are you? No, really, how are you? And so some simple tools there with powerful impacts and powerful ramifications when we're talking about life-saving tools. So, Dr. I know you wanted to just mention that Samaritan's number again, if you could do that, please.
Yeah, of course. Just come back to the idea that the right intervention at the right time is very important because of how impulsive some thoughts can be for all of us. So the Samaritans offer a great service 24/7. They have a free phone number, 116-123. So 116123. A range of other organizations. I know you have some great links from your website, but in particular, I've worked with the CALM, Campaign Against Living Miserably, or the calmzone.net, a website particularly aimed at young people and young people self-harm and suicide. There's an organization that I work with called Connecting with People. Do a lot of training for organizations, sports organizations or workplace organizations. Connecting with People offer a range of good training. I know we in Sports Chaplaincy have a lot of support for self-harm and suicide. And in my other role with State of Mind, we have literature and information available about that. Andy's Man Club, an open organization of men that meet each Monday to talk around risk and other stresses. So a range of organizations, and probably at the top of that list, I would have the Samaritans, just because of their availability, 116-123. 123 if you're feeling at all distressed or feel that you need to talk.
And all that will be put on our website, but there is a definite page on our website that all these can be found, which will, if you see sportschaplaincy.org.uk, there's a tab called Pastoral Support. If you hit that, it will take you to a list of Samaritans and mental health and AA and NA and GAMCAN and some other relationship support mechanisms and financial support mechanisms. Great organizations. So hit that link and you'll be signposted to some wonderful organizations who simply want to help you. But I do want to finish on this point. We've done these 5 mountains of mental health challenges. We've talked about depression, anxiety, addictions, anger, and now managing risk. And I do want to finish on this because I do think there's something powerful with the 2 words of hope. I do believe. So for me, I am a man of faith, and I do believe God's created it. It says he's created you. He had a plan and purpose for your life before the foundations of the earth. And that should give you a value that God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, thinks you have value. You were never an accident. However you may think you came to live on planet earth, I think you have value and have a worth, and we believe in you. So we want to speak that hope and life over you today as you listen. Please check out the other podcasts. And if you do have any questions, please email us at admin@sportschaplaincy.org.uk. We will do our best to help you or certainly signpost you to the appropriate support. Have a great day and thank you for listening.